Lucius Aeneas, Seneca lived a life that seems at first glance full of contradictions. He preached simplicity while accumulating immense wealth. He wrote about tranquility while navigating the most dangerous corridors of imperial power. He taught that death should not be feared. Yet, when death finally arrived, it came not as a quiet philosophical conclusion, but as a command from an emperor who had once called him teacher. Seneca's story is not merely the biography of a Stoic philosopher. It is the human struggle between ideals and reality, between wisdom and fear, between control and fate. Close your eyes now, and let the room around you soften as if dusk is lowering a veil across the walls. Imagine the air growing cooler, scented faintly with oil lamps and parchment. Hear the distant hush of a Roman street settling into night. Feel the quiet weight of centuries pressing gently rather than heavily. Because this story does not rush, it drifts. We are in Rome, but also not in Rome, because time here folds like fabric, and the past breathes slowly. Seneca is alive in this moment, not as a marble bust or a quotation in a book, but as a man walking carefully through a world that rewards cruelty and punishes reflection. The myth says Stoics are unshakable, immune to fear, carved from inner stone. Yet the truth is more intimate and more human, and historians still argue whether Stoicism was ever meant to remove fear or simply teach one how to sit beside it without panic. Seneca is present tense now, rising before dawn in a villa that is far too large for a man who writes about contentment with little. The marble floors cool underfoot, the sound of fountains murmuring outside like rehearsed calm. He is already short of breath, his chest tight. That familiar reminder that his body has always been an unreliable companion. And as he pauses to steady himself, there is a fleeting thought, half joke, half truth, that philosophy is easier to write when one is not gasping for air. He lives under Nero's reign, and the city feels like an animal that never fully sleeps. Even at rest, it listens, waiting to react, because power here is nervous, and nervous power is the most dangerous kind. Seneca knows this, and knowledge does not always bring comfort. He has written that death is nothing to fear, that it is merely the end of sensation, like falling into a dreamless sleep, yet his hands sometimes linger too long on the arms of his chair, as if reassuring himself that he is still anchored to the world. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is practice, repetition. A man repeating the lesson because the lesson has not yet fully settled. Roman society around him is loud in daylight and whispering in darkness. And in those whispers are names of men who vanished overnight, who were invited to dine and never returned, because an emperor's mood shifted like wind over water. Seneca moves through this landscape with careful grace, a ghost who is still alive, advising mercy in a system that survives on fear. And there is something almost tender in how often he returns to the topic of death in his writing, like someone touching a sawtooth, not out of masochism, but to measure whether the pain has lessened. He tells others that death is not an evil, that fearing it is irrational. And sometimes, late at night, he almost believes himself. The camera of our attention glides backward now, not abruptly, but like a slow breath exhaled, carrying us to Cordoba in Roman Spain, where Seneca is born around 4 BCE into privilege and expectation. The light there, harsher, the dust warmer, the future already mapped by his father, Seneca the Elder, whose voice trains young minds in rhetoric and whose ambitions are precise. The boy grows among words, arguments, and the steady pressure to excel. Yet his body betrays him early, lungs tightening, strength faltering, and illness becomes his first tutor in impermanence. He learns before most children that breath is borrowed, that strength is temporary, and this knowledge does not leave him. It hums beneath everything else. When he later studies Stoicism in Rome, alongside echoes of Epicurean moderation and Cynic disdain for excess, the philosophy does not arrive as abstract theory, but as potential medicine. And like all medicine, it tastes bitter at first. Stoicism promises freedom through inner discipline. Yet Seneca's life keeps placing him where discipline must coexist with compromise. And Rome is not kind to purity. He survives Caligula almost by accident, spared because an emperor assumes sickness will do the executioner's work, which is a dark joke history tells with a straight face. And then exile comes under Claudius, 8 long years on Corsica, where waves replace applause and silence becomes a collaborator rather than an enemy. Exile, Rome believes, is worse than death. But Seneca quietly tests that belief and finds it flawed, discovering that isolation sharpens thought, that consolation written for others often circles back to comfort the writer, and that a man can lose everything except his ability to reflect. When he returns, drawn back by Agrippina to tutor the young Nero, the air thickens again with risk, and Seneca steps once more into proximity with power, telling himself, perhaps sincerely, that he can guide it gently, that wisdom whispered can soften brutality shouted. For a time it seems almost true, and the early years of Nero's reign feel calmer, as if philosophy has a chance. But beneath the surface, something restless stirs, and Seneca senses it the way one senses a storm before the sky darkens. He writes, he advises, he accumulates wealth at a pace that startles even his friends, and he insists that wealth is indifferent, that only attachment corrupts, which is reasonable in theory and complicated in practice, especially when villas multiply like footnotes. There is soft irony here, gentle enough not to wake the sleeper. A philosopher teaching detachment while managing estates could almost be Rome's idea of a joke, and Seneca himself may have smiled at it on better days. As night deepens around us, the tension between myth and reality becomes the story's heartbeat, and we feel it without needing to resolve it, because this is not a tale of simple consistency, but of effort. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. End of part 1. The camera does not cut but drifts, as if carried by warm air through time, returning us to Cordoba, where Seneca is still young and the world has not yet taught him how sharp it can be. The Spanish sun pressing down on tiled roofs, cicadas humming like a living backdrop, the scent of olive oil and dust settling into memory. He is born into advantage, but advantage in Rome is never soft. It arrives wrapped in expectation, and his father's shadow stretches long across his childhood. Seneca the Elder is already respected for his rhetorical collections, a man who believes words shape destiny, and so the boy grows up surrounded by voices training other voices, learning early that speech is power long before he understands how dangerous power can be. Yet even as tutors sharpen his mind, his body quietly rebels, lungs tightening without warning, nights interrupted by breath that will not come easily, teaching him patience through discomfort and fear through fragility. It is here historians suggest that Seneca's philosophy begins not in books but in the body, because nothing introduces the concept of mortality more effectively than the sensation of air becoming scarce. Rome eventually calls, as it always does for ambitious families, and the young Seneca is carried to the capital, where marble dazzles and ambition hums like a second atmosphere. He studies rhetoric as expected, absorbing arguments the way stone absorbs heat. But philosophy draws him with a subtler gravity, especially Stoicism, which speaks of endurance, rational order, and the promise that one can be free even while constrained. He also listens to Epicureans who whisper about modest pleasure, and cynics who laugh at convention, assembling a worldview less rigid than later critics might assume, because Seneca is never purely one thing. In these years, he learns that Rome admires brilliance but punishes hesitation, and that moral clarity is admired most when it remains safely theoretical. His health worsens, improves, worsens again, and during one severe episode, he comes close enough to death that it leaves a mark deeper than fear, almost a familiarity, as if death has introduced itself politely and promised to return later. Seneca will later write that the wise rehearse death daily, but here the rehearsal is uninvited and visceral, his chest burning, vision dimming, the room narrowing to sensation alone. And when he survives, he carries with him a strange combination of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude for continued life, resentment that life feels so conditional. The myth of the fearless Stoic has no place yet. This is a young man learning that courage is not the absence of anxiety, but the decision to continue thinking while anxious, which is considerably harder. Rome in these days is politically unstable, emperors rising and falling with alarming speed, and the city teaches Seneca a lesson it will repeat often. Survival is not proof of virtue, merely of timing. He observes senators flatter tyrants they privately despise. Philosophers adjust their teachings depending on the audience, and somewhere inside him forms a quiet resolve to be useful without being naive, though the balance will never be perfect. His early writings, now mostly lost, are said to blend moral exhortation with practical advice, already showing a tendency to speak as if to a friend rather than to a crowd, which may explain why his later letters feel so intimate, like someone thinking aloud in the dark. Soft humor flickers even here, because Seneca is aware, perhaps with a dry smile, that Rome praises toughness, while fainting at the sight of honest self-examination, and he learns to present vulnerability as wisdom, which is safer. As his reputation grows, so does attention, and attention in Rome is both currency and threat, a truth he absorbs quietly. The section of his life closes not with triumph, but with readiness, as if he senses that philosophy alone will not protect him, but it might help him understand what happens next, and that understanding, he hopes, will be enough to steady his breathing when the air thins again. The drift of time carries us forward without a ripple, and Seneca is now a young man in Rome whose mind is sharpening even as his body continues its quiet rebellion. The city's sounds layering themselves into his thoughts like constant commentary. Vendors calling, sandals scraping stone, the distant clatter of carts, while his chest tightens unpredictably, reminding him that philosophy must coexist with physiology. He studies under Stoic teachers who speak of fate as rational order and virtue as the only good. Lessons that resonate deeply with someone who already knows how little control the body grants. And yet, he never fully surrenders to doctrinal purity, because Epicurean moderation still whispers its appeal, and cynic boldness amuses him, teaching him that wisdom may require flexibility rather than rigidity. This blending of schools later earns him criticism, but in these years, it simply feels practical, like carrying more than one tool when walking into uncertain terrain. His illnesses worsen at intervals, sometimes so severely that even his tutors worry he may not survive. And during one prolonged episode, he considers suicide, not out of despair but exhaustion, a fact he will later admit with startling candor, explaining that it was not philosophy but concern for his father that pulls him back. Historians still argue whether this moment shapes Seneca's later acceptance of suicide as rational exit, but the evidence suggests that death ceases to be abstract for him here, becoming instead a familiar presence that sits nearby, patient and unthreatening in its consistency. Rome rewards his talent nonetheless, and his eloquence earns public notice, though public notice in the early imperial court functions like a lantern in a forest, illuminating and exposing at the same time. Under Caligula, whose reign blends cruelty with theatricality, Seneca's skill places him dangerously close to imperial jealousy. And when Caligula considers executing him for speaking too well, a uniquely Roman compliment, Seneca survives only because the emperor believes his illness will finish the job soon enough, an assessment that is both chilling and faintly absurd. As if death could be scheduled by rumor, Seneca understands the message clearly. Talent is tolerated only when it flatters power or appears temporary. He writes later that life is like a play, not judged by length, but by performance. And perhaps the line begins forming here, when survival feels less like achievement and more like postponement. When Claudius replaces Caligula, the danger does not vanish. It simply changes shape, and political enemies accuse Seneca of adultery with Julia Livilla, charges widely considered fabricated, because truth in Rome bends easily when accusation serves convenience. Exile follows, and Corsica becomes his classroom in solitude. 8 years of rocky shores, relentless wind, and the kind of silence that initially feels like punishment, but slowly transforms into companion. Here the myth of exile as social death dissolves, because Seneca discovers that deprivation strips away distraction more efficiently than luxury ever could, and his writing deepens, turning inward, composing consolations addressed to grieving Romans that also console himself. He argues that loss is universal, that suffering is optional insofar as judgment shapes experience, and while the logic is neat, the emotion beneath it is raw, because exile sharpens awareness of vulnerability, and vulnerability refuses to stay theoretical. Soft humor surfaces occasionally, as when he notes that being removed from Rome spares him its noise and flattery, an observation that carries both relief and longing, because even Stoics miss familiar discomforts. His health remains unstable, and the island's harsh climate does not help, reinforcing his belief that circumstances matter less than response, a belief tested daily. When Agrippina recalls him to Rome to tutor her son Nero, Seneca accepts with caution, aware that proximity to power has nearly cost him everything before, yet also aware that refusal would be interpreted as ingratitude or worse. Nero is young, impressionable, and eager for admiration, and Seneca, alongside Burrus, attempts to shape him gently, emphasizing mercy and restraint, and for a brief period, it almost works. The early years of Nero's reign, marked by moderation, rare enough to feel miraculous. Seneca writes speeches, advises policy, and watches with guarded optimism as philosophy seems to exert influence beyond parchment. But success brings wealth, and wealth brings scrutiny, and Seneca's estates multiply until even sympathetic observers raise eyebrows, questioning how a Stoic reconciles luxury with doctrine. Seneca responds with careful reasoning, insisting that wealth is indifferent, useful, but not necessary, a position defensible yet uneasy, especially when comfort becomes habitual. He is not blind to the tension, and his letters increasingly sound like self-reminders, rehearsals against attachment, as if he senses that the stage is shifting again. Nero matures, and with maturity comes paranoia, cruelty, and a taste for absolute control that philosophy cannot soften indefinitely. Seneca attempts withdrawal, offering to return his wealth, seeking quiet retirement, but Nero refuses, understanding perhaps that a visible conscience stepping away looks too much like judgment. Seneca is trapped in relevance, too prominent to disappear safely, too reflective to ignore the danger, and so he turns increasingly to writing about death, freedom, and the one escape power cannot fully close. He frames death as release, not tragedy, and sometimes, reading between the lines, it feels like he is trying to convince himself that when the moment comes, fear will not overwhelm reason. There is no heroism here, only preparation, repetition, and the quiet hope that practice will matter when theory meets blood. Time keeps moving, as it always does in Seneca's world, without announcement or pause, and Rome subtly changes its posture as Nero grows older, like a young animal discovering its strength and testing the limits of its enclosure, while Seneca, now fully embedded within the machinery of power, walks carefully through each day, as though the floor beneath him might thin without warning. The city's rhythms continue, markets opening, courts convening, spectacles rehearsed. But beneath these familiar motions runs a current of unease, because Rome senses when an emperor's temperament is drifting, and Nero's drift is unmistakable. In the early years, Seneca's influence is tangible. Edicts are measured, executions rare, and the language of mercy still appears in imperial speeches. Words Seneca crafts with precision, believing, perhaps hoping, that language can shape reality if spoken often enough. Yet language is a fragile shield, and Seneca knows this, because Stoicism has taught him that externals obey forces beyond moral reasoning. Nero begins to resent restraint, perceiving it as limitation rather than guidance, and the mentor-student dynamic strains as admiration curdles into suspicion, a pattern historians note repeatedly in autocratic systems where counsel eventually feels like criticism. Seneca watches this shift with a practiced stillness, his outward composure masking the careful calculations of a man who understands that withdrawal itself can be interpreted as rebellion. He continues to write, producing essays that praise clemency and self-control, works that seem both philosophical and quietly political, as if he is addressing not only Nero, but Rome itself, and perhaps also the future, just in case the present refuses to listen. His wealth continues to grow, sometimes through gifts he cannot refuse, sometimes through investments that multiply without his direct involvement, and he insists publicly that riches are morally neutral, a position consistent with Stoic doctrine, yet increasingly difficult to defend as villas expand and critics sharpen their accusations. Soft humor flickers here like candlelight. Even Seneca might privately acknowledge that it is easier to preach detachment from silk when one is not sleeping on straw, a truth Stoicism allows, but pride dislikes admitting. Nero's behavior grows erratic, and the murders begin, not immediately, not all at once, but with enough frequency to erode the illusion of stability, and Seneca's influence wanes as flatterers replace advisers, because flattery demands less courage than counsel. The philosopher feels the walls closing in, not physically, but psychologically, as paranoia becomes policy and silence becomes safer than speech. He requests permission to retire, offering to surrender his wealth and step away quietly, framing the request as fatigue rather than moral objection. But Nero refuses, understanding instinctively that a philosopher who leaves voluntarily becomes a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. Trapped between visibility and vulnerability, Seneca turns inward more intensely, and his letters to Lucilius take on a confessional tone, addressing fear, aging, and death with increasing urgency, as though he senses time narrowing. He writes that life is long enough if used wisely, that fear of death wastes the present, and yet his repetition suggests the lesson remains incomplete, like a melody that never quite resolves. Historians still argue whether Seneca's continued presence at court constitutes complicity or survival, but such debates often underestimate the inertia of power, which does not release its participants easily. Seneca lives in a state of suspended readiness, each morning potentially his last in freedom, each night an opportunity to rehearse acceptance. When the Pisonian conspiracy is uncovered, Rome's atmosphere thickens instantly, suspicion spreading faster than evidence, because Nero does not require proof when fear already provides justification. Seneca's involvement is unclear, and ancient sources disagree on whether he knew of the plot or merely suffered its aftermath. But in an empire ruled by paranoia, ambiguity is guilt enough. The order arrives calmly, almost politely. Seneca is instructed to take his own life, a command delivered without ceremony, because Rome treats elite death as administrative procedure. Seneca receives the message with outward composure, calling friends to his side, speaking gently, as if this moment has been rehearsed many times, in writing, if not in flesh. He opens his veins, expecting a swift end, but the body resists, blood flowing slowly, stubborn even now. And irony settles in quietly, because the philosopher who argued that death is indifferent discovers that dying is inconveniently physical. Poison fails to act quickly, heat is applied to hasten the process, and through it all, Seneca continues to speak, dictating thoughts, embodying stoic calm as performance, if not entirely as feeling. Because courage does not require comfort. His wife Paulina attempts to join him, cutting her own veins, and historians debate whether this act is devotion, despair, or stoic consistency. But Nero intervenes, ordering her saved, unwilling to multiply martyrs unnecessarily. Seneca's death is prolonged, uncomfortable. far from the serene ideal often imagined. And in this lies a final lesson. Philosophy prepares the mind, not the nerves. Whether fear visits him in those last moments remains unknown. But his writings suggest that fear does not negate virtue. It merely accompanies it. His legacy unfolds slowly after his death, surviving emperors, religions, and centuries, because his honesty resonates more than his certainty, and readers recognize themselves in a man who strives without claiming perfection. As the candle of his life gutters and fades, Rome continues its restless breathing, unaware that it has just lost one of its quiet mirrors, and the night settles back into stillness, carrying with it the echo of a voice that never promised fearlessness, only understanding. The story does not end with blood cooling on marble, because ideas have a longer breath than bodies. And as time moves forward, the echo of Seneca's voice continues to drift through Rome like incense that lingers after ritual, soft but persistent. The city absorbs his death quickly, as it absorbs everything, returning to its habits of spectacle and survival. Yet something subtle remains altered, because Seneca's final performance, calm, verbal, stubbornly reflective, has already begun to turn into example. Tacitus records the scene with careful distance, noting the slowness of death, the composure maintained even when the body refuses cooperation. And historians still argue whether Tacitus emphasizes dignity to contrast Nero's cruelty, or simply reports what witnesses described. But either way, the image fixes itself in cultural memory. A philosopher dying not swiftly, not cleanly, but deliberately, as if insisting that meaning can exist even when comfort does not. Paulina survives, pale and marked, living on as a reminder that stoic resolve does not extinguish attachment, and perhaps never intended to, because stoicism, despite its reputation, is not a philosophy of emotional absence, but of emotional proportion. As years pass, Nero's reign collapses into chaos and suicide, and Rome enters another cycle of upheaval, emperors rising and falling like figures in a restless dream, while Seneca's writings quietly detach themselves from their political context and begin traveling independently, copied by hands that never knew his face. His letters to Lucilius become companions to readers who feel pressed by time, age, illness, and fear, offering not certainty, but orientation, a way to sit with anxiety without letting it dictate every movement. He speaks of death often, not as threat, but as boundary, reminding readers that limits clarify value, and there is a faint, almost tender irony in how often people return to these letters precisely because they fear the very thing Seneca insists need not terrify them. Soft humor appears here centuries later in the realization that humanity has been anxious about dying for a very long time and remains stubbornly unsatisfied with philosophical reassurance, as if expecting wisdom to function like a switch rather than a practice. Christianity rises, and some early thinkers read Seneca with interest, even suspicion, noting how closely some Stoic ethics align with emerging Christian morality, leading to legends, entirely unfounded but persistent, that Seneca corresponded with the Apostle Paul, a myth that speaks less about history and more about the desire to recruit respected voices for new narratives. In truth, Seneca remains firmly Roman, his worldview shaped by civic duty, personal discipline, and acceptance of fate rather than divine redemption. Yet his influence stretches across traditions, because his concerns are not bounded by theology. Medieval scholars preserve his texts, Renaissance humanists rediscover them, and modern readers quote him in moments of stress, illness, or ambition, often without realizing how carefully his calm is constructed atop admitted vulnerability. Historians debate whether Seneca truly feared death or merely acknowledged fear as part of the human condition. But the distinction may be less important than it appears, because his work never promises fearlessness, only clarity, and clarity is a quieter achievement. He writes that life is not short but squandered, a line that comforts and unsettles simultaneously, suggesting that meaning depends less on duration than attention. And this idea finds resonance in every era that feels hurried. Seneca's wealth remains a point of contention, a footnote that refuses to fade, yet even this controversy reinforces his relevance, because it mirrors the modern tension between ideals and circumstances, between ethical aspiration and material reality. He never claims sainthood, never insists on exemplary purity, and this refusal to posture may be his most persuasive trait, because it allows readers to engage without feeling judged. The camera of our attention slows now, pulling back to reveal Seneca, not as isolated genius, but as node in a long continuum of thinkers wrestling with impermanence. And his contribution feels less like resolution and more like companionship. As night deepens and the story continues its gentle forward drift, Seneca's presence remains, not demanding agreement, only offering a seat beside him in the dim light where fear can be examined rather than denied, and where death, acknowledged honestly, loses some of its power to startle. Time flows onward with the same unhurried patience Seneca once urged upon his readers, and the world that follows his death does not rush to closure, because ideas, like embers, glow longest when left undisturbed. Rome reshapes itself again, emperors changing names and faces while retaining familiar anxieties, and Seneca's words slip quietly into private libraries, into the satchels of students, into the margins of minds that feel crowded by ambition and fear. His philosophy begins to live a second life, detached from the man who wrote it. And in this separation, something curious happens. The contradictions that once troubled his critics soften into texture, becoming evidence not of failure, but of humanity. Readers encounter a stoic who admits struggle, a teacher who confesses imperfection, and this honesty feels unexpectedly intimate across centuries. Seneca speaks of death not as an abstract endpoint, but as a companionable boundary, reminding his audience that awareness of finitude sharpens appreciation rather than dulling it. And historians still argue whether his persistent return to mortality reflects unresolved anxiety or deliberate method. But perhaps it is both, because repetition is often how humans learn what intellect grasps faster than emotion. His essays on anger, brevity of life, and tranquility circulate widely, valued for their conversational tone, as if he is sitting across from the reader, lowering his voice, acknowledging shared unease. Soft humor surfaces occasionally in these texts, a dry awareness that humans insist on complicating what philosophy tries to simplify, and one can almost imagine Seneca smiling faintly at the predictability of this pattern. As Stoicism evolves, later thinkers adopt his ideas selectively, some emphasizing endurance, others rational order, and still others the ethical duty of engagement, because Seneca himself never offers a closed system, only a toolkit. His acceptance of suicide under extreme conditions continues to provoke debate, especially as moral frameworks shift, and scholars note that Roman Stoicism treats autonomy differently from later traditions, framing voluntary death as preservation of agency rather than escape from suffering, a distinction subtle but crucial. In this, Seneca remains unmistakably of his time, shaped by an elite culture where honor, dignity, and public perception intertwine tightly. Yet his emotional insights transcend that context, because fear, attachment, and regret refuse to stay confined to any era. As centuries pass, the myth of the unfeeling Stoic persists, and Seneca's writings quietly undermine it from within, revealing a philosophy less about suppression than about calibration, teaching not the eradication of feeling, but its proportionate expression. Readers notice how often he reassures rather than commands, how frequently he reminds himself alongside others, and this shared vulnerability becomes his bridge to the future. The narrative camera glides gently now through medieval scriptoria, Renaissance studies, modern bedrooms lit by screens, where someone reads a line about death being nothing to us and pauses, breathing a little more evenly, not cured of fear but steadied by recognition. Seneca's life, viewed whole, resists tidy moralization, and perhaps that resistance is its lesson, because it mirrors the unresolved nature of human striving. He lived amid wealth, yet warned against dependence, wielded power, yet distrusted it, feared death, yet reasoned with it. And these tensions remain familiar because they are not historical anomalies, but enduring conditions. As the night deepens, his voice continues to murmur, not insisting on agreement, only offering perspective. And in that offer lies a quiet comfort, the reassurance that wisdom does not require perfection, only persistence, and that even fear, when acknowledged honestly, can become a companion rather than a tyrant. The movement of the story continues forward like a slow tide, and Seneca's presence now feels less like a man and more like a tone carried through time, a voice that adjusts itself to each new listener without losing its core warmth. In Rome's later centuries, Stoicism itself becomes something quieter, less political, more inward, and Seneca's writings slip naturally into this transformation because they were never entirely about systems or slogans, but about how a person feels when lying awake, counting breaths, wondering how much time remains. He speaks often of the present moment, of how fear pulls the mind forward into imagined endings, and readers across eras recognize themselves in that habit immediately, because the human tendency to rehearse disaster has not changed. His insistence that death is merely the end of sensation begins to feel less like doctrine and more like reassurance offered late at night, the kind that does not argue loudly, but repeats itself patiently until panic loosens its grip. Historians still argue whether Seneca's emphasis on mortality is excessive even by Stoic standards. But excess may be exactly the point, because repetition is how anxiety is softened, not eliminated. In the centuries after Rome's political power fades, Seneca's texts endure precisely because they are portable, easily separated from imperial context, and reattached to private life, to illness, to aging, to loss. A monk copying his letters by candlelight feels the same quiet tension Seneca describes, the pull between acceptance and attachment, and perhaps smiles faintly at the recognition that even a Roman courtier once struggled with the same impatience toward fate. Soft humor appears here in the realization that time humbles everyone equally, turning emperors into footnotes and anxious thoughts into familiar companions. Seneca's wealth, once a scandal, becomes almost irrelevant to later readers who are more interested in his emotional honesty than his property ledger. Because luxury ages poorly, but vulnerability does not. His concept of freedom through inner discipline gains renewed appeal in periods when external freedom feels fragile. And this cyclical relevance reinforces the sense that Seneca wrote not only for his own moment, but for recurring human conditions. He reminds readers that fear of death is often fear of unfinished business, fear of wasted potential. And this reframing gently redirects attention from the unknown future to the usable present. The camera of attention lingers on his letters again, noticing how often he advises gradual practice rather than sudden transformation, suggesting that wisdom accumulates through habit, not revelation. And this patience feels especially soothing in a world that prefers instant solutions. Seneca's voice remains calm but never distant, offering companionship rather than authority. And this tone distinguishes him from other moralists who demand adherence rather than reflection. His acceptance of imperfection continues to resonate because it allows readers to engage without shame, acknowledging fear without surrendering to it. As the story drifts further forward, Seneca becomes less a historical figure and more a recurring presence, a familiar voice that surfaces whenever mortality presses close, reminding listeners that fear is not evidence of failure, but of attention, a sign that life is being taken seriously. The night deepens, the pace slows, and his words settle gently into the quiet, not promising immunity from fear, only the steady reassurance that fear can be understood, reasoned with, and carried without panic. And in that understanding, rest becomes possible. The passage of time remains smooth and unbroken, and Seneca's voice now moves through the world almost invisibly, like breath in a darkened room, present even when unnoticed, shaping thought without demanding attention. His ideas begin to settle into the private spaces of life rather than public forums, because fear of death, like fear itself, prefers solitude where it can speak honestly. Readers encounter Seneca not in triumph, but in vulnerability, and this changes how Stoicism is understood, softening its edges, making it less about endurance for display and more about endurance for living. He insists that death is natural, no more frightening than birth. Yet he never treats this insight as obvious, returning to it repeatedly as if each repetition chips away at resistance. Because humans rarely accept difficult truths on first hearing. Historians still argue whether Seneca's constant reassurance signals personal anxiety unresolved, but anxiety acknowledged may be the very mechanism by which wisdom remains active rather than decorative. In later centuries, when plague, war, and uncertainty dominate daily life, Seneca's reflections feel startlingly relevant because he speaks not from safety, but from proximity to danger. And this lends his calm a credibility that abstract theory lacks. Soft humor flickers in his recognition that people prepare endlessly for life's accessories, while ignoring its inevitable conclusion. A pattern that persists stubbornly, as if humanity believes that neglecting death might somehow inconvenience it into postponement. Seneca's framing of death as liberation from fear rather than annihilation begins to resonate, especially with those trapped by circumstance, illness, or obligation, because it offers not escape, but perspective, a way to loosen the grip of dread without denying reality. The camera of attention drifts through generations of readers who find in Seneca's words a mirror for their own restlessness, noticing how often he emphasizes readiness rather than resignation, preparedness rather than longing, suggesting that peace lies not in wishing for permanence, but in practicing impermanence gently. His acceptance of emotional fluctuation, his admission that fear arises even in the disciplined mind, quietly dismantles the myth that philosophy grants immunity, replacing it with the more humane promise of resilience. Seneca never claims that courage feels pleasant, only that it feels possible. And this distinction matters because it aligns expectation with experience. As modernity approaches, his ideas resurface in new contexts, stripped of Roman ritual, but retaining their emotional core, offering solace to individuals navigating pressure, ambition, and mortality under different names but with familiar sensations. His insistence that life is long enough when used wisely becomes both comfort and challenge, reminding readers that fear often grows in unused time, in moments surrendered to distraction rather than attention. The night deepens further now, and Seneca's presence becomes almost companionable, less teacher than fellow traveler, acknowledging the shared unease of existence without rushing to resolution. He suggests that fear diminishes when observed patiently, like a sound that loses intensity when listened to closely. And this observation carries quiet authority because it arises from lived struggle rather than detached certainty. As the story continues its forward drift, Seneca remains steady, not because he has conquered fear, but because he has learned how to walk beside it without letting it dictate his pace. And in that measured movement lies a form of peace that feels attainable, human, and gently reassuring as the darkness settles comfortably around the listener. The slow passage of centuries does not dilute Seneca's relevance. Instead, it seems to clarify it, as if time itself were editing away distractions to leave the core concerns exposed and quietly glowing. His reflections on death begin to function less as arguments and more as companions, returning to readers during moments when certainty thins and the future feels unsteady. Seneca speaks to those moments directly, reminding them that fear does not arise from death itself, but from the stories the mind constructs around it. Stories rehearsed so often they begin to feel real, and this insight feels modern because it describes a mechanism rather than issuing a command. He writes that death is not an event to be experienced, but a boundary beyond experience. And while the logic is simple, its acceptance is slow, requiring repetition, patience, and kindness toward one's own hesitation. Historians still argue whether Seneca truly believed this fully, or whether belief remained aspirational. But aspiration itself may be the point, because philosophy in his hands becomes practice rather than proclamation. His calm tone never shames fear. Instead, it acknowledges fear as evidence of care, a sign that life matters enough to be difficult to release. This reframing subtly transforms anxiety from weakness into attentiveness, a shift that feels gentle rather than confrontational. Soft humor appears again in his observation that people who claim not to fear death often fear far smaller inconveniences intensely, a reminder that bravado is rarely consistent. As the story moves forward, Seneca's ideas begin to merge with broader discussions of mortality across cultures, influencing thinkers who may not name him directly, but echo his insistence that acceptance begins with attention. He encourages readers to imagine death often, not to darken life, but to brighten it by contrast. And this paradoxical instruction feels counterintuitive, yet quietly persuasive, because imagining an ending can clarify what deserves presence now. His letters advise moderation, routine, and reflection, practices that stabilize the mind against sudden shocks. And modern readers recognize these as early forms of psychological grounding, though Seneca would simply call them habits of reason. The camera of our attention drifts into private rooms where individuals read his words alone, perhaps late at night, sensing that the voice addressing them does not rush, does not demand, but waits patiently for understanding to arrive in its own time. Seneca's own fear, implied rather than confessed outright, gives these words weight, because reassurance offered by someone who has never trembled rings hollow, while reassurance shaped by struggle carries credibility. He never claims mastery over emotion. He claims commitment to dialogue with it, and this distinction allows readers to approach fear without judgment. As centuries accumulate, the historical Seneca fades while the experiential Seneca remains, less concerned with Roman politics than with universal moments of vulnerability. His acceptance of impermanence resonates especially in eras marked by rapid change, reminding listeners that instability is not anomaly, but condition. He writes that nothing truly belongs to us except time used wisely, and this idea feels both liberating and sobering, because it shifts responsibility inward without cruelty. The story continues its unbroken flow, and Seneca's presence feels increasingly intimate, like a voice that lowers itself to match the listener's breath, guiding without directing. He suggests that the mind fears death most when it clings to illusions of permanence, and that releasing these illusions gradually reduces anxiety, a process requiring patience rather than force. Historians still debate the extent to which Seneca's personal circumstances shaped his emphasis on mortality, but his circumstances resemble those of many who feel pressure, illness, or uncertainty, and this resemblance sustains relevance. As night deepens, his words soften into reassurance, not promising safety from loss, only the possibility of meeting loss without panic. And in that promise lies rest. Seneca remains steady and imperfect, offering not answers but orientation. And the story drifts onward, carrying his quiet companionship through time, easing the listener gently toward calm reflection as the darkness becomes less threatening and more like a shared space for thought. The current of the narrative carries us onward, smooth and unbroken, and Seneca's thoughts now feel fully unmoored from the marble and politics of Rome, floating instead through the inner landscapes of those who encounter them in moments of quiet vulnerability. His reflections on death begin to merge seamlessly with reflections on time, because for Seneca, the two are inseparable. Death giving shape to time, the way shoreline gives shape to water. He reminds readers that life is not short by nature, but made short by distraction, by postponement, by the constant assumption that there will be more later. And this observation lands gently yet persistently, like a hand resting on the shoulder rather than a finger pointing in accusation. Historians still argue whether Seneca's emphasis on urgency reflects regret over compromises made at court or simply philosophical clarity refined by experience. But regret and clarity are not mutually exclusive, and his writing often suggests they coexist quietly. He urges daily reflection, not as moral accounting but as orientation, a way to notice how fear steals time by projecting imagined endings forward, leaving the present underused. Soft humor flickers when he notes that people guard their property carefully while allowing their hours to be taken freely, a habit so common that it almost escapes notice. And yet recognizing it produces a subtle shift in attention. Seneca's advice feels increasingly therapeutic in the modern sense, though he never uses such language, because he understands that fear thrives in vagueness and diminishes under observation. And so, he invites readers to look closely, patiently, without expectation of immediate relief. His own life, marked by illness and proximity to danger, lends authority to this invitation because it arises from necessity rather than abstraction. The camera of attention lingers on his insistence that preparation for death is preparation for life, a reversal that feels paradoxical yet comforting, because it suggests that awareness of endings intensifies presence rather than diminishing it. Seneca does not encourage obsession with mortality. Instead, he recommends familiarity, as one might grow familiar with darkness in a room, discovering that it is less threatening once the eyes adjust. This metaphor recurs subtly throughout his work, reinforcing the idea that fear often arises from unfamiliarity rather than inherent harm. Readers sense that Seneca is speaking to himself as much as to them, rehearsing calm not because he has mastered it, but because mastery requires repetition. And this shared practice fosters intimacy across centuries. He writes of freedom as inner alignment rather than external circumstance, a definition shaped by his own inability to escape power's reach. And this redefinition resonates with those who feel constrained by forces beyond their control. Seneca's acceptance of impermanence does not erase grief or attachment. Instead, it contextualizes them, allowing emotion without surrendering to despair. And this balance feels humane rather than austere. As the narrative continues, his presence becomes increasingly gentle, less concerned with proving Stoicism's correctness than with offering companionship in uncertainty. He acknowledges that fear may never vanish entirely, but insists it need not dominate, a claim modest enough to feel believable. Historians still debate whether Seneca achieved the peace he advocated, but his writings suggest that peace, for him, was not a permanent state, but a recurring effort, renewed daily, imperfectly. This framing allows readers to approach philosophy without intimidation, seeing it not as a destination, but as a path walked repeatedly, sometimes falteringly. As night deepens further, Seneca's words settle into the background like a steady rhythm, guiding attention away from imagined futures and back toward the quiet immediacy of the present moment. The story moves forward without haste, carrying with it the reassurance that fear, when met with patience and reason, loses some of its urgency, and that even in a world shaped by uncertainty, one can learn to rest within awareness itself, breathing evenly, accompanied by a voice that never promised certainty, only steadiness. The narrative continues its gentle forward motion, and Seneca's thoughts now seem to inhabit the quiet intervals of life, those spaces between tasks and distractions, where the mind wanders toward questions it usually avoids. His meditations on death deepen into meditations on control, because for Seneca, the fear of dying is inseparable from the fear of losing command over one's own story. He reminds readers that most suffering arises not from events themselves, but from resistance to their inevitability, a claim that sounds simple until tested by illness, aging, or loss. And Seneca knows this because his own body has tested it relentlessly. Historians still argue whether his chronic illness exaggerated his focus on mortality or sharpened it. But the distinction matters less than the result. A philosophy attuned to fragility rather than offended by it. Seneca writes that the wise person rehearses adversity in advance, not to invite misfortune, but to soften its shock. And this practice resembles a kind of mental stretching, preparing the mind to bend rather than snap. Soft humor appears when he notes that people prepare extensively for journeys they may never take, while refusing to prepare for the one journey that cannot be avoided. A gently ironic observation that has lost none of its accuracy over time. His emphasis on voluntary simplicity, on needing less to fear less, gains clarity when viewed alongside his own struggle with wealth, because it reveals aspiration rather than hypocrisy, a man aiming toward detachment while acknowledging how sticky comfort can be. The camera of attention lingers on this tension, because it is here that Seneca feels most alive, suspended between ideals and habits, aware of the gap and unwilling to pretend it does not exist. He advises limiting desire as a way to reduce fear, since fear often mirrors attachment, growing in proportion to what one believes cannot be surrendered. This insight resonates quietly because it reframes fear not as enemy, but as indicator, pointing toward unexamined clinging. Seneca's letters increasingly emphasize the present moment as the only domain where agency truly exists, suggesting that anxiety steals life by borrowing time from now and lending it to imagined futures. He does not deny the mind's tendency to wander. Instead, he invites it back repeatedly, patiently, as one might guide a restless animal rather than punish it. This gentleness distinguishes his stoicism from harsher interpretations, revealing a philosophy less about domination of emotion and more about collaboration with it. His acceptance of death as boundary rather than catastrophe continues to anchor his work, and readers sense that this acceptance is practiced, not possessed, maintained through repetition rather than revelation. Historians still debate whether Seneca's own end fulfilled his ideals, but perhaps fulfillment was never the goal. Alignment, however temporary, may have been enough. As the story drifts onward, Seneca's presence becomes increasingly internal, less a historical figure than a set of questions offered quietly. What do you fear? What do you cling to? What could be released without loss of self? These questions do not demand immediate answers, and their openness creates space rather than pressure. The night deepens, the pace slows further, and Seneca's voice lowers almost to a whisper, suggesting that courage is not loud, that acceptance does not announce itself, and that peace arrives in increments small enough to be missed unless one is attentive. He reassures that fear may revisit, that progress is uneven, and that this unevenness does not invalidate the effort, because philosophy, like life, unfolds in moments rather than conclusions. As the listener rests within this unfolding, the story continues forward, steady and unbroken, carrying Seneca's quiet companionship through the dark, offering not certainty, but a way to sit comfortably with uncertainty itself, breathing, listening, and allowing the mind to soften into the calm that comes from understanding limits rather than resisting them. The motion of the story remains unhurried, and Seneca's reflections now settle into a deeper layer of quiet, where fear is no longer an urgent alarm, but a low, familiar hum, acknowledged without alarm. His writings increasingly suggest that mastery over fear does not come from force, but from familiarity, from sitting with the thought of death until it loses its power to shock, much as a dark room becomes navigable once the eyes adjust. He advises readers to imagine loss deliberately and gently, not as punishment, but as training, a way to reduce the mind's habit of treating impermanence as betrayal. Historians still argue whether this practice is psychologically liberating or emotionally demanding, yet its persistence across centuries suggests it meets a human need unmet by denial. Seneca understands that fear grows in the absence of attention, thriving on vagueness, and so he invites clarity, urging people to name what they fear precisely, because named fears tend to shrink. Soft humor appears when he observes that people fear death intensely, while fearing thought hardly at all, despite the fact that thought is what creates most of the terror, a remark that lands lightly but lingers. His emphasis on inner freedom becomes more pronounced here, framed not as withdrawal from life, but as selective engagement, choosing where to invest emotional energy rather than scattering it indiscriminately. Seneca's own life, constrained by illness and politics, lends credibility to this framing, because it emerges from lived limitation rather than abstract optimism. He writes that true freedom lies in wanting nothing that fate can deny, a sentence that reads less like instruction and more like aspiration, because wanting nothing requires practice, patience, and repeated adjustment. The camera of attention drifts through moments when readers test this idea quietly, noticing how fear loosens slightly when expectations soften, how calm increases when attachment relaxes, even temporarily. Seneca does not promise permanence. He promises possibility, and this modesty feels reassuring rather than disappointing. His discussions of death continue to intertwine with discussions of gratitude, suggesting that awareness of finitude intensifies appreciation, that knowing time is limited sharpens perception rather than dulling it. This reframing gently counters the assumption that thinking about death darkens life, proposing instead that it illuminates what matters. Historians still debate whether Seneca's optimism here is earned or aspirational, but optimism grounded in effort rather than outcome carries a quiet strength. He encourages daily review of actions and reactions, not as self-judgment, but as calibration, a way to notice patterns without shame. And this practice feels remarkably contemporary, anticipating later therapeutic approaches without naming them. Seneca's voice remains calm but never distant, offering companionship rather than authority, and this tone allows readers to approach difficult ideas without defensiveness. As the narrative continues, His presence feels increasingly like a steady hand guiding attention back from imagined futures to the immediate present, where breath, sensation, and awareness reside. He reminds that fear often projects itself forward, borrowing certainty from imagination, and that returning attention to now interrupts this cycle gently. The night deepens further, and Seneca's words soften into reassurance, suggesting that peace is not the absence of fear, but the ability to coexist with it without urgency. He accepts that fear may never vanish completely, and this acceptance itself reduces its intensity because it removes the pressure to conquer what can instead be understood. As the story glides onward, uninterrupted and calm, Seneca remains a quiet companion, offering perspective shaped by struggle, reminding the listener that even in a world governed by impermanence, one can learn to rest within awareness, letting fear pass through without resistance, breathing steadily as the darkness becomes less a threat and more a shared, peaceful space. The narrative continues its smooth, unbroken glide, and Seneca's presence now feels deeply internal, almost like a rhythm beneath thought itself, guiding attention without demanding it. His reflections on death subtly shift toward reflections on habit, because Seneca understands that fear is not merely a reaction, but a routine, reinforced by repetition and neglect, and that changing one's relationship with fear requires reshaping daily practice rather than dramatic resolution. He advises cultivating mental routines that anticipate loss without dramatizing it, small rehearsals that render the inevitable less startling. And historians still argue whether such rehearsal risks dulling joy, yet Seneca insists the opposite is true, that joy becomes clearer when not shadowed by surprise. Soft humor surfaces in his observation that people train their bodies meticulously while leaving their minds untrained, then express shock when panic arrives uninvited, a remark that carries gentle irony rather than rebuke. His letters emphasize consistency over intensity, suggesting that wisdom accumulates like sediment, slowly, invisibly, through repeated attention, and this framing relieves the pressure to achieve sudden enlightenment. Seneca's own struggles with health and power reinforce this view, because his calm, when it appears, is hard-won and temporary, renewed through effort rather than guaranteed by doctrine. He writes that fear often arises when imagination outruns reason, constructing futures more vivid than evidence warrants. And he invites readers to slow imagination down, to ask what is actually happening now, a question that quietly returns the mind to stability. The camera of attention lingers on this practice, noticing how often Seneca redirects focus to the present moment, not because the future is unimportant, but because the present is where agency lives. He suggests that acceptance is not resignation, but alignment, a willingness to cooperate with reality rather than fight it endlessly. And this distinction feels crucial because resignation drains energy while alignment conserves it. Historians still debate whether Seneca's emphasis on acceptance reflects Stoic doctrine or personal necessity shaped by limited options. But necessity and doctrine often intertwine, producing insights that feel earned rather than theoretical. His discussions of death become increasingly gentle, almost conversational, as if he senses that forceful argument only provokes resistance, while familiarity breeds calm. He reminds readers that dying is not a failure, but a completion of nature's process, a thought that may sound stark, yet carries a quiet reassurance, because it situates individual fear within a broader order. Seneca does not deny grief or attachment. He acknowledges them as natural responses to value, and this acknowledgement prevents stoicism from hardening into indifference. His voice continues to offer permission to feel without surrendering to feeling, a balance that feels humane and sustainable. As the story moves forward, his presence becomes less instructional and more companionable, a steady influence encouraging patience with one's own learning curve. He writes that progress is uneven, that setbacks are inevitable, and that recognizing this prevents discouragement, a lesson he appears to have learned through repeated disappointment. The night deepens, the pace slows further, and Seneca's words seem to synchronize with breathing itself, suggesting that calm is not something to achieve, but something to notice when conditions allow. He reassures that fear may return, that practice does not eliminate vulnerability, but that familiarity transforms fear from tyrant into signal, from overwhelming force into information. As the narrative continues its uninterrupted flow, Seneca remains present as a quiet guide, offering perspective shaped by lived constraint and thoughtful reflection, reminding the listener that wisdom grows not through dramatic conquest, but through steady, compassionate attention to the realities that cannot be changed and the responses that can. And in this gentle distinction, rest becomes possible, the mind settling into the darkness, not as an enemy, but as a familiar space where understanding deepens and anxiety loosens its hold. The story continues without pause, and Seneca's influence now feels like a slow current beneath the surface of thought, shaping attitudes toward power, fear, and self-command long after Rome's stones begin to crumble. His ideas about death drift naturally into ideas about authority, because Seneca understands that fear of dying and fear of losing control share a common root, both arising from the belief that stability can be guaranteed if one holds tightly enough. He warns that power intensifies anxiety rather than relieving it, a lesson learned firsthand in imperial corridors, where proximity to authority magnifies risk instead of diminishing it. Historians still argue whether Seneca's time beside Nero sharpened or compromised his philosophy, but the tension itself becomes instructive, illustrating how wisdom is tested most severely where stakes are highest. Seneca writes that no one is powerful who fears loss, and this sentence carries the weight of lived experience because he knows how fear bends judgment, distorts loyalty, and erodes calm. Soft humor appears in his observation that people seek positions promising security only to discover that higher ground attracts stronger winds, an image that quietly captures the irony of ambition. His reflections suggest that freedom is inversely related to dependence, that the more one requires outcomes to feel safe, the more vulnerable one becomes to fear, a concept that resonates deeply with those navigating complex systems of obligation. The camera of attention glides through Seneca's arguments about voluntary simplicity, noticing how often he frames it not as deprivation, but as insulation, a way to reduce exposure to anxiety by narrowing what can be taken away. He acknowledges how difficult this is in practice, especially for those embedded in structures that reward excess, and his honesty here prevents the idea from becoming moral theater. Seneca's own wealth remains an unresolved tension, but rather than undermining his message, it highlights the challenge of aligning ideals with circumstance, a challenge many recognize intimately. He writes that one should possess wealth as a traveler carries provisions, ready to set them down without distress. And while this image is elegant, its difficulty is implicit because travelers grow attached to what sustains them. Historians still debate whether Seneca truly maintained this detachment, but the effort itself becomes the lesson, revealing that Stoicism measures intention and practice rather than flawless execution. His discussions of death now feel inseparable from discussions of courage, not the dramatic courage celebrated in spectacle, but the quiet courage of consistency, of maintaining values under pressure, without expectation of recognition. Seneca frames courage as reason sustained under stress, a definition that feels grounded rather than heroic, aligning with his emphasis on internal alignment over external display. The narrative drifts through moments where readers apply these ideas privately, noticing how fear diminishes when control is released selectively, how calm increases when acceptance replaces resistance, even briefly. Seneca does not promise permanent tranquility. He promises moments of clarity, and this modest promise feels credible, achievable, and therefore comforting. His insistence that death equalizes all conditions continues to soften fear by reframing hierarchy as temporary, reminding readers that emperors and servants share the same ending, a thought both humbling and reassuring. Soft humor flickers again in the recognition that humanity has spent millennia inventing status distinctions that death ignores entirely. A quiet cosmic joke Seneca seems to appreciate. As night deepens, his voice grows gentler, encouraging listeners to examine where fear arises from attachment to outcomes beyond control, and to experiment with loosening that attachment gradually. He suggests that peace emerges not from winning against fate, but from cooperating with it intelligently, a stance that conserves energy and reduces inner conflict. The story continues its forward glide, unbroken and calm, carrying Seneca's reflections through the darkness like a steady lantern, illuminating not the entire path, but enough ground to walk without panic, reminding the listener that even amid uncertainty, there exists a way of being that neither denies fear nor surrenders to it, but holds it carefully, with reason, patience, and a growing sense of quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself to be real. The flow of the narrative carries us onward, and Seneca's presence now feels like a steady awareness moving beneath events rather than reacting to them, a consciousness trained to notice where fear originates before it spreads. His reflections increasingly center on the illusion of permanence, because Seneca understands that much of human anxiety arises from treating temporary arrangements as though they were guaranteed, and he gently dismantles this habit by reminding readers that change is not an interruption of life, but its constant condition. He writes that nothing truly belongs to us except the present use of time, a statement that initially unsettles because it strips away imagined security, yet gradually comforts because it clarifies where attention is best placed. Historians still argue whether Seneca's emphasis on impermanence reflects philosophical conviction or personal resignation shaped by constrained choices. But resignation and realism often share the same vocabulary, differing mainly in tone. Seneca's tone remains warm, almost companionable, acknowledging how difficult it is to release expectations once they have taken root. Soft humor appears in his observation that people complain loudly about change while quietly benefiting from it, an irony that feels timeless and gently disarming. His advice encourages reducing dependence on outcomes rather than eliminating desire entirely, recognizing that desire itself is not the enemy, but attachment to specific results can magnify fear beyond proportion. The camera of attention lingers on this nuance because it reveals stoicism as adjustment rather than denial, a recalibration of hope rather than its extinction. Seneca's letters often return to the idea of readiness, suggesting that preparing for loss does not diminish joy but stabilizes it, allowing enjoyment without panic at its eventual end. This readiness is not grim. It is practical, like keeping one's footing on uneven ground, and it grows through habit rather than sudden resolve. Historians still debate how consistently Seneca practiced this readiness in his own life, particularly during his final years at court. But his writing suggests that consistency was always aspirational, maintained imperfectly, renewed through effort rather than assumed as possession. His discussions of death continue to serve as anchors, grounding reflection in reality rather than speculation, and readers sense that he speaks from proximity to danger rather than theoretical distance. He reframes fear of death as fear of unfinished intention, encouraging attention to what can be completed now rather than what might be lost later, a redirection that feels empowering rather than evasive. Seneca does not deny regret. He simply refuses to let it dominate the present, suggesting that awareness of limits can sharpen commitment rather than dull it. As the narrative drifts forward, his voice becomes increasingly reassuring, less concerned with argument and more with orientation, guiding attention gently back to what is within reach. He acknowledges that the mind resists this redirection, preferring certainty even when certainty is illusory, and he treats this resistance with patience rather than frustration. Soft humor flickers again in his recognition that humans would rather fear known illusions than face unknown realities calmly, a tendency he treats with understanding rather than scorn. The night deepens, the pace slows further, and Seneca's reflections settle into a rhythm that mirrors breathing itself, steady and unforced. He suggests that peace arises not from eliminating uncertainty, but from learning to live comfortably alongside it, recognizing that control is always partial, and that this partiality need not provoke panic. As the story continues its uninterrupted glide, Seneca remains a quiet guide, offering perspective shaped by illness, power, loss, and reflection, reminding the listener that life's fragility does not negate its value, but defines it, and that fear, when examined honestly and patiently, can become less an enemy and more a signal guiding attention toward what matters most, allowing rest to arrive naturally as the darkness feels less like threat and more like shelter. The narrative flows onward without interruption, and Seneca's reflections now settle into the quiet domain of habit and character, where fear no longer arrives as sudden crisis, but as a familiar visitor whose patterns can be anticipated. He increasingly emphasizes that the mind is shaped less by isolated insights than by repeated attention, and that courage, like fear, is learned through rehearsal. Seneca understands that people often wait for extraordinary moments to practice philosophy. Yet extraordinary moments rarely announce themselves politely, and so he advises preparing during ordinary days when the stakes feel low and the mind is more receptive. Historians still argue whether this emphasis reflects Stoic orthodoxy or Seneca's personal need for structure amid uncertainty. But need and philosophy often meet where guidance is most effective. He suggests that fear loses intensity when encountered regularly in small, manageable doses, much as darkness feels less overwhelming when one moves through it daily rather than suddenly. Soft humor appears in his observation that people train relentlessly for professions they may leave while neglecting to train for living itself, a gentle irony that lingers because of its accuracy. His letters continue to frame death not as interruption, but as completion, a boundary that grants shape to effort rather than negates it, and this framing gradually transforms dread into perspective. Seneca does not claim that thinking about death will feel pleasant. He claims it will feel clarifying, and this distinction keeps expectation aligned with experience. The camera of attention glides through passages where he encourages moderation in ambition, not because ambition is evil, but because excess ambition multiplies points of fear, attaching self-worth to outcomes beyond control. He notes that the mind often suffers more from anticipation than from reality itself, a pattern he recognizes intimately from years spent under imperial suspicion. His proximity to power has taught him that unpredictability is not exception but rule, and that peace requires internal anchors rather than external guarantees. Seneca's emphasis on self-sufficiency here is subtle rather than absolute, acknowledging that humans remain social creatures who care deeply about connection, and he treats this care as strength rather than weakness. He suggests that fear arises not from caring, but from believing that what we care about must last indefinitely, and this belief, once examined, begins to loosen its hold. Historians still debate whether Seneca's repeated reassurances signal unresolved anxiety, but reassurance offered repeatedly may simply reflect realism about how slowly fear changes. His writing never scolds. It returns patiently to the same points, as if aware that understanding arrives incrementally, often when resistance has grown tired. Soft humor flickers again when he remarks that people demand certainty from life while refusing to accept it from themselves, an observation that gently exposes a double standard without accusation. As the story moves forward, Seneca's presence becomes increasingly soothing, less like instruction and more like accompaniment, a steady reminder that imperfection does not disqualify effort. He acknowledges setbacks openly, noting that even practiced minds stumble, and that such stumbles are not evidence of failure, but opportunities to resume alignment. This forgiving tone distinguishes his stoicism from harsher interpretations, making it accessible rather than intimidating. His reflections on death continue to function as grounding tools, returning attention from imagined catastrophes to the simplicity of breath, sensation, and awareness. He writes that one should not postpone living out of fear of losing life, a sentence that carries quiet urgency precisely because it avoids drama. As night deepens further, Seneca's words begin to feel almost like a lullaby of reason, repeating themes not to persuade but to soothe, guiding the listener toward acceptance without force. He suggests that calm is not a permanent state, but a recurring return, reached again and again through practice, and this framing removes pressure to maintain serenity at all times. The narrative continues its uninterrupted glide, and Seneca remains present as a gentle companion, offering a way to relate to fear that neither denies it nor amplifies it, but integrates it into a broader understanding of impermanence, effort, and care. In this understanding, rest becomes possible, not because uncertainty disappears, but because it is no longer mistaken for threat, and the darkness surrounding the listener feels less like an abyss and more like a quiet, shared space where reflection softens into ease. The movement of the story continues, steady and unbroken, and Seneca's reflections now circle more closely around sincerity, because fear, he understands, feeds on pretense, growing strongest where a person performs confidence they do not feel. He writes that pretending to be fearless exhausts the mind far more than admitting uncertainty, and this admission feels quietly radical in cultures that reward composure as spectacle. Historians still argue whether Seneca's public calm masked private dread or reflected genuine alignment. Yet this tension itself illustrates his insight. Fear does not vanish when hidden, it multiplies. Seneca encourages honesty with oneself as a form of courage, suggesting that naming anxiety reduces its power to surprise, a principle echoed in many later traditions, though expressed here with Roman restraint. Soft humor appears in his observation that people who loudly declare indifference to death often devote extraordinary effort to avoiding minor discomforts, a contradiction he notes gently, without mockery. His letters increasingly emphasize inner dialogue, the quiet conversation one maintains with oneself when no audience is present. Because it is here, he believes, that fear either softens or hardens. He advises addressing fear as one would a worried friend, with patience rather than scorn, recognizing that harshness only deepens resistance. The camera of attention lingers on this idea because it reframes self-discipline not as internal domination, but as cooperation, aligning reason and emotion rather than forcing one to silence the other. Seneca's acceptance of emotional reality allows Stoicism to breathe, preventing it from calcifying into doctrine, and readers sense that his wisdom grows not from detachment, but from intimacy with his own limits. He writes that no one is brave by accident, that courage emerges through repeated choice rather than temperament, and this framing relieves the pressure to feel fearless before acting. Historians still debate whether Seneca achieved this courage consistently, particularly during his final years at court. But his writings suggest that courage for him was situational, renewed moment by moment rather than secured permanently. His discussions of death now feel less abstract and more relational, treating mortality not as enemy, but as constant companion, one that clarifies priorities by its presence. He suggests that fear diminishes when death is acknowledged openly rather than treated as taboo, because secrecy grants it imaginative power. Soft humor flickers again in his remark that humans spend more time avoiding the thought of death than the experience itself ever requires. A subtle reminder that anticipation often outweighs reality. As the narrative continues, Seneca's voice grows softer, more reflective, as if aware that understanding arrives more readily when spoken quietly. He emphasizes that fear thrives in isolation, but weakens in shared awareness, and his letters, though written centuries ago, perform this sharing across time, readers feel addressed personally, as if Seneca anticipates their hesitation, their doubt, and meets it without judgment. He does not promise resolution. He promises companionship in uncertainty. And this promise feels sustainable. As night deepens, his reflections settle into a gentle rhythm, guiding attention inward without pressure, encouraging the listener to notice how fear ebbs slightly when acknowledged honestly. Seneca suggests that peace is not achieved by defeating fear, but by ceasing to flee from it, a shift that conserves energy and restores balance. The story continues its calm forward glide, and Seneca remains present as a quiet guide, reminding the listener that sincerity with oneself is a form of courage available at any moment, and that within this sincerity, fear loses some of its urgency, allowing the mind to rest more easily, the darkness feeling less like threat and more like space for quiet understanding. The narrative glides onward without pause, and Seneca's reflections now gather around the idea of endings not as rupture, but as completion, a thought he returns to with increasing tenderness, as if aware that fear often arises from imagining death as theft rather than fulfillment. He writes that nature finishes nothing abruptly, that seasons turn gradually, that bodies age incrementally, and that death follows the same rhythm, even when it appears sudden to those watching. Historians still argue whether this view reflects philosophical conviction or emotional necessity, yet necessity often refines conviction into something usable. Seneca encourages readers to observe how everything they love already exists within change, how familiarity with small endings prepares the mind for larger ones. And this observation feels quietly grounding, because it frames loss as continuity rather than catastrophe. Soft humor appears in his gentle remark that humans protest endings loudly, while celebrating beginnings that are simply endings renamed, a subtle irony that invites reflection without discomfort. His letters increasingly emphasize gratitude as counterweight to fear, suggesting that appreciation for what has been reduces anxiety about its eventual absence, because gratitude anchors attention in experience rather than anticipation. The camera of attention lingers on this pairing, noticing how fear diminishes slightly when attention shifts from preservation to presence, from guarding to receiving. Seneca does not suggest ignoring pain. He suggests contextualizing it, recognizing that pain signals value rather than failure, and this reframing softens resistance without denying difficulty. He writes that one should live each day as a complete unit, not because tomorrow is unimportant, but because completeness now reduces regret later, a perspective shaped by his own proximity to abrupt endings. Historians still debate whether Seneca's insistence on daily completeness reflects wisdom or self-soothing, but self-soothing grounded in clarity often becomes wisdom by repetition. His reflections on death now feel almost parental in tone, protective rather than instructive, as if he is guiding the reader through fear rather than explaining it. He acknowledges that the mind resists such guidance, preferring distraction or deferral, and he treats this resistance with patience, recognizing it as habit rather than flaw. Soft humor flickers again when he observes that people avoid thinking about death, yet devote extraordinary effort to planning futures that assume its absence. A contradiction he presents gently, allowing recognition to arise naturally. As the story continues, Seneca's presence becomes increasingly reassuring, less concerned with shaping belief and more with easing tension, offering permission to let go of vigilance. He reminds that vigilance exhausts, that constant guarding against loss steals energy better spent living. And this reminder arrives softly, without urgency. His acceptance of mortality does not diminish love or ambition. It clarifies them, sharpening intention by revealing limits. And readers sense that this clarification is what gives his philosophy endurance. As night deepens, his words slow further, settling into a cadence that mirrors rest itself, encouraging the listener to release the day's mental grip. Seneca suggests that peace comes not from certainty about endings, but from trust in one's capacity to meet them when they arrive. A trust built gradually through honest attention rather than bravado. The narrative continues its uninterrupted flow, and Seneca remains a quiet companion, offering a way to understand endings as part of life's structure rather than its negation, allowing fear to soften into acceptance and acceptance to soften further into rest as the darkness surrounding the listener becomes calm and familiar, a place not of threat but of gentle completion. The story continues its calm forward movement, and Seneca's reflections now settle into the terrain of memory. Because fear of death, he understands, is often fear of being erased, of leaving no trace that mattered. He writes that permanence is an illusion humans cling to out of insecurity, and that seeking immortality through reputation or legacy often amplifies anxiety rather than soothing it. Because reputation lives at the mercy of others' opinions, which are as unstable as weather. Historians still argue whether Seneca's prolific writing represents a bid for remembrance or simply the natural output of a mind trained to think aloud. But the two motives need not conflict, and his awareness of legacy feels reflective rather than desperate. Seneca encourages readers to locate meaning in lived moments rather than imagined remembrance, suggesting that being fully present now outweighs being remembered later, a thought that initially unsettles but gradually reassures. Soft humor appears when he observes that people crave lasting fame while forgetting how quickly they themselves forget yesterday's news, a gentle reminder of how selective memory truly is. His discussions of death now emphasize continuity of nature rather than survival of self, reframing the end of individual consciousness as participation in a larger process that neither judges nor remembers. And this reframing reduces the pressure to matter eternally. The camera of attention drifts through this idea carefully, noticing how fear loosens slightly when the burden of significance is set down, even briefly. Seneca does not argue that life lacks meaning without permanence. He argues that meaning deepens when freed from the demand to endure indefinitely. He writes that a short life can be complete if lived attentively, and this assertion challenges the assumption that length determines value, offering instead a qualitative measure rooted in engagement. Historians still debate whether Seneca's own life achieved this completeness, given his compromises and entanglements. But completeness, as he defines it, does not require purity, only awareness. His letters increasingly frame fear as misplaced focus, attention directed toward imagined absence rather than experienced presence. And he invites readers to practice shifting this focus gently, without force. Soft humor flickers again in his remark that people fear being forgotten while forgetting to notice the day unfolding around them. A contrast that lands softly but resonates deeply. Seneca's acceptance of anonymity after death feels quietly liberating because it releases the self from the pressure to perform meaning for an audience that may never arrive. He suggests that living well is sufficient without witness, an idea shaped by his awareness of how public approval fluctuates unpredictably. The narrative continues to glide, and his presence feels increasingly intimate, addressing fears that often remain unspoken, fears of insignificance, of vanishing without mark. Seneca meets these fears not with reassurance of legacy, but with redirection, guiding attention back to what can be done now, how one treats others, how one uses time, how one responds to inevitability. He writes that time given fully is never wasted, even if forgotten. And this line carries quiet comfort because it decouples value from recognition. As night deepens, his voice softens further, encouraging the listener to release the need to be remembered, to rest instead in the knowledge that participation in life itself is enough. He acknowledges that the mind resists this idea, preferring guarantees, and he treats this resistance gently as habit rather than failure. Historians still argue whether Seneca personally found peace in this perspective, but his writing suggests that peace was not constant, only accessible, revisited when attention aligned. As the story continues its uninterrupted flow, Seneca remains a calm companion, offering a way to meet fear of erasure with presence rather than protest, reminding the listener that meaning does not require permanence, only sincerity, and that within sincere attention, fear softens, urgency fades, and the darkness surrounding the listener becomes less about disappearance and more about rest, a quiet space where nothing needs to be preserved, proven, or remembered in order to be complete. The narrative continues its steady glide, and Seneca's reflections now turn toward community and solitude because fear of death, he observes, behaves differently when shared than when hidden. He writes that humans are social by nature, yet often face mortality in isolation, believing fear is something to conceal rather than acknowledge, and this concealment intensifies its grip. Historians still argue whether Seneca himself felt isolated at the end of his life despite being surrounded by others, but his writing suggests an acute awareness that companionship does not automatically dissolve loneliness. Seneca encourages selective sharing, honest conversation with trusted minds, not for reassurance alone, but for clarity. Because speaking fear aloud often reveals its shape more clearly than silent rumination. Soft humor appears when he notes that people readily discuss trivial ailments, yet grow silent around existential ones, as if silence could prevent their arrival, a gentle irony that feels familiar even now. His letters increasingly emphasize friendship as philosophical practice, a space where reflection is tested, softened, and humanized, because ideas spoken only to oneself risk becoming rigid. The camera of attention lingers on this social dimension of Stoicism, noticing how Seneca's advice balances self-sufficiency with connection, rejecting both dependency and isolation as extremes. He writes that fear often diminishes when mirrored in another's understanding, not because the outcome changes, but because the burden is redistributed, making it easier to carry. Seneca's own friendships, maintained through correspondence and counsel, reflect this belief, offering him continuity even when political danger limits trust. Historians still debate how open Seneca could truly be under Nero's reign, yet the persistence of his letters suggests a sustained effort to remain connected despite risk. His reflections on death now incorporate compassion, reminding readers that their own fear often mirrors the fear of others, and that gentleness toward oneself extends naturally toward those sharing the same fate. Soft humor flickers again when he remarks that humans unite easily around celebrations, but hesitate around shared vulnerability, a pattern that reveals more about discomfort than strength. Seneca reframes solitude not as absence of others, but as presence with oneself, encouraging periods of quiet reflection to complement social engagement. Because fear thrives in extremes, either overwhelmed by noise or amplified by isolation, he suggests alternating between connection and solitude as a way to stabilize the mind, a rhythm that mirrors natural cycles rather than resisting them. As the narrative drifts forward, his voice remains calm, attentive to nuance, avoiding prescriptions that ignore individual temperament. He acknowledges that some find comfort in company, others in quiet, and that wisdom lies in noticing which conditions soften fear rather than intensify it. Seneca's acceptance of death continues to anchor these reflections, reminding readers that shared mortality binds all relationships, offering both fragility and meaning. He writes that awareness of common fate can deepen kindness, reducing the urgency to dominate, impress, or compete, because such efforts feel less compelling when measured against impermanence. Historians still argue whether Seneca's emphasis on community reflects idealism or practical necessity, but the distinction blurs when ideas prove useful, regardless of origin. His writing avoids sentimentality, grounding compassion in realism rather than hope for reward. As night deepens, his words encourage the listener to consider where fear isolates and where it could invite connection, suggesting that acknowledging vulnerability often opens space for understanding. He reassures that solitude need not be lonely when chosen deliberately, and that companionship need not be overwhelming when entered thoughtfully. The story continues its uninterrupted flow, and Seneca remains a quiet guide, offering a balanced vision of human life where fear is neither hidden nor dramatized, but shared or held gently as circumstances allow. In this balance, anxiety softens, and the darkness surrounding the listener feels less like isolation and more like a shared night sky under which countless others have reflected, worried, and rested. Discovering that fear, when approached with honesty and connection, loses its urgency and becomes simply another aspect of the human condition, manageable, understandable, and quietly companionable. The story moves forward with the same unbroken calm, and Seneca's reflections now gather around freedom, not as political condition, but as inner posture, because he understands that fear of death often mirrors fear of losing autonomy, of becoming powerless before forces one cannot negotiate with. He writes that true freedom is not the ability to control outcomes, but the ability to align one's will with what cannot be controlled, a definition that initially feels counterintuitive, yet gradually reveals its practicality. Historians still argue whether Seneca arrived at this definition through philosophical reasoning or personal necessity, shaped by life under imperial authority. But necessity has a way of distilling philosophy into something precise and usable. Seneca's proximity to absolute power taught him that external freedom is fragile, easily revoked, while internal freedom, though harder to cultivate, cannot be confiscated by decree. Soft humor appears in his observation that people often feel most enslaved while pursuing what they believe will make them free, a paradox that remains quietly accurate. His letters encourage readers to examine where they have surrendered agency unnecessarily, where fear has convinced them that compliance is safety, and he suggests that reclaiming small choices restores dignity, even in constrained circumstances. The camera of attention lingers on this idea, noticing how fear diminishes when agency is recognized within limits rather than sought beyond them. Seneca does not deny the reality of constraint. He lived surrounded by it, and this realism prevents his advice from becoming naive. He writes that acceptance of fate is not submission but strategy, a way to preserve integrity when resistance would only invite destruction. And this distinction feels especially relevant in environments where power is asymmetrical. Historians still debate whether Seneca should have resisted more openly, yet such judgments often overlook the calculus of survival under tyranny, where defiance can silence a voice permanently. Seneca's reflections on death reinforce this concept of freedom, presenting mortality as the ultimate boundary that equalizes all power structures, reminding readers that no authority extends beyond life itself. Soft humor flickers again when he notes that tyrants fear death as much as their subjects, despite their elaborate displays of control, a reminder that fear respects no hierarchy. His writing suggests that recognizing this shared vulnerability reduces intimidation, because it reframes power as temporary rather than absolute. As the narrative continues, Seneca's presence feels steady, neither defiant nor submissive, modeling a posture of internal independence that does not rely on external validation. He encourages readers to practice letting go of outcomes daily, training the mind to rest in effort rather than result, because effort remains within control even when results do not. This practice, repeated gently, transforms fear from overwhelming force into manageable signal, guiding adjustment rather than panic. As night deepens, his words soften further, inviting the listener to notice where tension arises from resisting what cannot be altered, and to experiment with releasing that resistance gradually. Seneca reassures that this release does not diminish selfhood. It clarifies it, stripping away false demands until what remains feels lighter, more durable. The story continues its uninterrupted glide, and Seneca remains a quiet companion, offering a vision of freedom rooted not in domination or escape, but in alignment, reminding the listener that even within limits, there exists a spaciousness of response where fear loosens its grip, agency returns in subtle forms, and rest becomes possible. The darkness no longer threatening confinement, but offering a wide, quiet field in which the mind can settle without struggle. The narrative continues its gentle, uninterrupted glide, and Seneca's reflections now turn towards time itself, because fear of death, he understands, is inseparable from how humans experience time slipping through their grasp. He writes that people suffer not because time is scarce, but because they live as if it were endless, postponing attention, postponing courage, postponing presence, until anxiety accumulates like unspent currency. Historians still argue whether Seneca's fixation on time reflects regret over years spent near power, or simply philosophical clarity sharpened by age. But regret and clarity often share the same silence. Seneca urges readers to treat each day as a complete life in miniature, not with frantic urgency, but with mindful sufficiency, suggesting that completeness, not length, quiets fear most effectively. Soft humor appears when he observes that people guard their calendars fiercely, while allowing their lives to be interrupted endlessly, a contradiction that reveals how easily urgency masquerades as importance. His letters emphasize attention as the true measure of living, arguing that fear grows when awareness is deferred, when the present is sacrificed to imagined futures that may never arrive. The camera of attention lingers on this idea, noticing how fear softens when time is experienced fully rather than anxiously managed. Seneca does not advocate withdrawal from planning or responsibility. Instead, he encourages anchoring plans in awareness, ensuring that anticipation does not eclipse experience. He writes that the mind often lives ahead of the body, and that this dislocation breeds unease, a diagnosis that feels remarkably modern. Historians still debate whether Seneca's advice reflects Stoic doctrine or personal coping strategy developed under constant threat. But coping refined by thought often becomes philosophy by another name. His reflections on death now emphasize that mortality grants time its value. That urgency arises not from fear of ending, but from forgetting that an ending exists. And this reversal reframes death as ally rather than adversary. Soft humor flickers again in his remark that people behave as though time were limitless, while panicking at the thought that life is not, a paradox that gently exposes denial without accusation. Seneca encourages deliberate pauses, moments of reflection woven into routine, because fear thrives in constant motion, where the mind never settles long enough to notice what it is doing. He suggests that slowing attention, even briefly, restores proportion, allowing concerns to shrink back to their actual size. As the narrative continues, his voice grows increasingly soothing, guiding the listener toward an experience of time that feels spacious rather than pressured. He acknowledges that this spaciousness must be practiced, that habit pulls attention outward relentlessly, and he treats this pull with patience rather than frustration. Seneca's acceptance of death continues to anchor these reflections, reminding readers that time need not be conquered or optimized, only inhabited honestly. He writes that one who has learned how to use time has learned how to live, a sentence that feels less like instruction and more like quiet reassurance. As night deepens, his words slow further, encouraging the listener to release the urge to measure, to schedule, to anticipate, and instead to rest in the simple fact of being present. He reassures that nothing essential is lost by pausing, that fear often recedes when urgency loosens its grip. The story continues its uninterrupted flow, and Seneca remains a calm companion, offering a way to experience time not as enemy, but as medium. A gentle current carrying awareness forward without haste. In this current, fear of death softens into respect for limits, respect into gratitude, and gratitude into calm, allowing the listener to feel time not as something running out, but as something unfolding quietly, moment by moment, sufficient as it is, inviting rest rather than resistance as the darkness settles into a peaceful, timeless stillness. The story continues its calm, unbroken movement, and Seneca's reflections now draw closer to the fragile boundary between control and surrender, because he understands that fear of death often intensifies where the mind insists on mastery over what is fundamentally unmasterable. He writes that anxiety arises not from events themselves, but from the demand that events conform to expectation, and that this demand quietly exhausts the spirit long before circumstances ever do. Historians still argue whether Seneca's emphasis on surrender reflects philosophical maturity or the psychological adaptation of a man long exposed to danger. Yet surrender, as he frames it, is not collapse but discernment, a choosing of where effort is meaningful and where it is wasted. Seneca encourages readers to distinguish between what requires action and what requires acceptance, a distinction he considers the foundation of calm, because confusion here multiplies fear unnecessarily. Soft humor appears when he notes that people often fight hardest against what cannot be changed while neglecting what can be improved, a habit that reveals more stubbornness than strength. His letters return repeatedly to the idea that peace depends less on rearranging the world than on arranging one's responses, a perspective sharpened by years of watching power shift unpredictably. The camera of attention lingers on this internal reordering, noticing how fear diminishes slightly when resistance relaxes, when the mind stops arguing with reality and begins cooperating with it instead. Seneca does not romanticize surrender. He acknowledges that letting go feels like loss at first, because identity often intertwines with control, and releasing that grip can feel disorienting. Yet he insists that beneath this disorientation lies relief, a widening of inner space once occupied by constant vigilance. Historians still debate whether Seneca himself achieved this relief consistently, particularly during his final months under Nero's suspicion. But his writing suggests that relief was experienced intermittently, enough to confirm its possibility even if permanence remained elusive. His reflections on death now feel inseparable from reflections on trust. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in one's capacity to respond wisely when outcomes arrive. He writes that fear of dying often masks fear of being unprepared, and that preparation consists not in prediction, but in cultivating steadiness, a quality developed gradually through honest self-observation. Soft humor flickers again in his observation that people seek guarantees from life while refusing to guarantee their own attention, a mismatch that quietly fuels anxiety. Seneca encourages readers to practice meeting discomfort without immediate reaction, allowing sensation and thought to arise and pass without judgment, a practice that weakens fear's authority by removing its urgency. This practice feels gentle rather than austere, aligning with his broader approach of persuasion through patience rather than force. As the narrative drifts forward, his voice grows increasingly calm, almost reassuring in its refusal to dramatize endings. He reminds that death is not an interruption of life's logic, but its completion, a final alignment with nature's rhythm. And this reminder softens fear by placing it within a larger continuity. Seneca does not deny grief or attachment. He honors them as evidence of engagement, suggesting that fear diminishes when emotion is acknowledged rather than suppressed. Historians still argue whether this openness represents stoic flexibility or personal innovation. But innovation grounded in lived experience often proves most enduring. His writing avoids absolutes, preferring nuance, because nuance accommodates reality better than rigid doctrine. As night deepens, his reflections encourage the listener to notice where fear arises from insistence rather than circumstance, from the refusal to allow uncertainty its place. He suggests experimenting with release in small ways, relinquishing minor expectations to build confidence in letting go, a strategy that mirrors his belief in gradual practice over dramatic change. The story continues its uninterrupted glide, and Seneca remains a steady companion, offering a way to relate to fear not as something to conquer, but as something to understand and integrate. He reassures that surrender does not erase agency. It refines it, concentrating effort where it matters and freeing the mind from futile struggle. In this refinement, calm becomes more accessible, not as permanent condition, but as recurring experience, revisited whenever attention aligns with reality. As the darkness surrounding the listener grows quieter and more familiar, Seneca's voice settles into a gentle cadence, inviting rest through understanding rather than escape, reminding that even in a world shaped by uncertainty and endings, there exists a way of being that feels grounded, spacious, and quietly free, allowing fear to soften into acceptance and acceptance into a restful awareness that carries the story forward without resistance, without urgency, and without fear. The narrative moves onward without any break in its gentle current, and Seneca's reflections now draw close to the moment where theory and flesh finally meet, because fear of death, he knows, reveals its true character only when abstraction dissolves and the body becomes undeniable. He writes that philosophy is tested not in classrooms or letters, but at the edge of experience, when pain, uncertainty, and finality converge, and this conviction gives his words a quiet gravity. Historians still argue whether Seneca anticipated his ordered death long before it arrived, yet his repeated attention to endings suggests not prediction, but preparedness, a steady turning toward what could not be ruled out. Seneca insists that the measure of wisdom is not what one claims in safety, but how one responds when choice narrows, and this idea becomes increasingly present as his own life approaches that narrowing. Soft humor appears, subdued but unmistakable, when he notes that many speak boldly of dying well while carefully avoiding even mild discomfort, a gentle reminder that courage is often rehearsed far from its stage. His reflections emphasize that the body does not always cooperate with the mind's conclusions, that pain and fear can arise even when understanding is clear, and he treats this not as failure, but as reality. The camera of attention lingers on this distinction because it reframes courage not as absence of sensation, but as refusal to let sensation dictate meaning. Seneca prepares readers for the possibility that dying may be slow, awkward, and undignified by ideal standards, and that dignity, therefore, must be internal rather than aesthetic. Historians still debate whether his own death matched his philosophical expectations, but the sources agree that it was prolonged, resistant, and deeply human, and this humanity reinforces rather than undermines his teaching. He writes that death is not something to be perfected, but something to be met, and that meeting it with clarity, even imperfectly, fulfills philosophy's promise. Soft humor flickers again when he observes that humans rehearse grand exits while tripping over ordinary moments, an irony that gently dissolves the fantasy of control. Seneca's reflections now emphasize forgiveness toward oneself, recognizing that fear may surface even at the end, and that its presence does not negate a life of effort. He reassures that philosophy does not demand serenity as performance, only sincerity in response, a distinction that removes the pressure to appear calm rather than be attentive. As the narrative drifts closer to the historical moment of his death, Seneca's voice grows quieter, not because it weakens, but because it no longer needs to persuade. He suggests that readiness consists not in certainty, but in familiarity, in having walked the terrain of fear often enough that its contours no longer shock. Historians still argue whether Seneca feared death in his final hours, but fear acknowledged and fear denied led to different outcomes. And his writings suggest he chose acknowledgement. He writes that one should not be ashamed of trembling, only of surrendering judgment to tremor, a line that feels less like doctrine and more like permission. As night deepens, his words soften into reassurance, encouraging the listener to accept that endings rarely conform to ideals, and that this imperfection does not diminish their meaning. The story continues its uninterrupted flow, and Seneca remains present as a quiet companion at the threshold, offering a vision of courage that accommodates weakness, of wisdom that survives discomfort, and of acceptance that does not require beauty to be real. In this vision, fear loses its authority, not because it vanishes, but because it is no longer mistaken for truth, allowing the mind to rest even as the body acknowledges its limits, and the darkness surrounding the listener feels less like a final boundary and more like a gentle passage, familiar, inevitable, and quietly approachable. The story continues without interruption, and Seneca's reflections now stand fully at the edge where life and ending overlap, where the distance between thought and experience narrows until they touch. In these final considerations, he returns not to argument but to witness, because he understands that fear loses much of its power when it is seen clearly rather than theorized endlessly. He writes that death does not arrive as a philosophical problem, but as a physical event, accompanied by sensations the mind cannot negotiate away, and this honesty anchors his stoicism in reality rather than idealization. Historians still argue whether Seneca anticipated the precise manner of his death, yet his writings suggest an acceptance of unpredictability rather than rehearsal of a specific script. Seneca prepares readers for the possibility that courage may feel quieter than expected, that clarity may coexist with discomfort, and that calm may arrive unevenly, in waves rather than as a steady state. Soft humor surfaces gently when he observes that humans imagine dramatic final moments while overlooking the fact that most of life, including its end, unfolds without audience or applause, a reminder that meaning does not require spectacle. His reflections emphasize attention as the final refuge of freedom, the capacity to observe experience without surrendering interpretation to fear. And this capacity, he insists, remains accessible even when options diminish. The camera of attention lingers on this idea, noticing how fear often intensifies when the mind leaps ahead of sensation, constructing narratives that overwhelm the present moment. Seneca advises returning attention to what is actually occurring: breath, warmth, sound, because reality, though sometimes uncomfortable, is usually less terrifying than imagination. Historians still debate whether Seneca maintained this attentiveness throughout his own death, but the sources describe him speaking calmly, dictating thoughts, engaging with those around him, suggesting not perfection, but presence. His insistence that philosophy prepares one to live rather than to die now feels fully realized, because his engagement in those final hours reflects continuity rather than rupture. He does not abandon his values when they are tested. He adapts them to circumstance, accepting slowness, pain, and interruption without interpreting them as failure. Soft humor flickers again when he notes that people expect endings to be efficient, forgetting that nature rarely prioritizes convenience, an observation that gently dismantles unrealistic expectations. Seneca's reflections here emphasize compassion, both toward oneself and toward others who witness the end, recognizing that fear radiates outward as well as inward. He acknowledges that those present may feel distress, even when the one dying feels composed, and he treats this not as contradiction, but as evidence of connection. His writing suggests that preparing for death includes preparing to be seen in vulnerability, to allow others their reactions without needing to manage them. Historians still argue about the precise emotional atmosphere of Seneca's final moments, but the enduring image is not one of theatrical stoicism, but of thoughtful endurance. A man continuing to reflect even as his body resists closure. Seneca reframes dignity not as control over outcome, but as integrity of response, a definition that remains viable even when circumstances become chaotic. He writes that one should aim not for a beautiful death, but for a truthful one, an ending aligned with how one has lived, attentive, reflective, and honest about limitation. As the narrative moves gently through this threshold, his voice becomes less explanatory and more affirming, offering reassurance that fear does not disqualify courage, that discomfort does not negate wisdom, and that imperfection does not erase effort. He accepts that fear may surface at the end, not as betrayal, but as habit, and that meeting it with awareness is sufficient. As night deepens further, his reflections soften into something almost tender, suggesting that the final task is not mastery, but consent, a willingness to let experience unfold without resistance. The story continues its unbroken glide, and Seneca remains present as a quiet companion at this edge, offering a vision of courage grounded in attention rather than bravado, of freedom preserved through awareness rather than control. In this vision, fear loses its dominance because it is no longer mistaken for instruction, and the listener feels the darkness not as threat, but as a natural extension of the day, a space where struggle ends not in defeat, but in release, allowing the mind to rest within understanding, carried forward gently by the same current that has guided the story all along. The narrative continues its steady, unbroken glide, and now the focus rests fully on the moment after Seneca's life has ended, where fear gives way to aftermath, and meaning begins its slow separation from flesh. Rome absorbs his death with practiced efficiency, because the city has long learned how to continue without pausing for reflection. Yet beneath this surface continuity, something subtle shifts, as if a familiar voice has gone quiet and left behind an unusual stillness. Seneca's body, finally released from effort, becomes still in a way philosophy can only gesture toward, and the contrast between prolonged struggle and sudden absence underscores one of his quiet truths, that death itself is often simpler than the path toward it. Historians still argue how those present interpreted his final hours, whether they saw triumph, tragedy, or mere endurance. But endurance itself becomes the most honest description, because it contains no embellishment. His wife Paulina survives, marked physically and inwardly, and her continued life carries a silent complexity, a reminder that Stoic ideals coexist with attachment, that love does not dissolve neatly in philosophy's light. Seneca's writings do not condemn this attachment, they anticipate it, acknowledging that care deepens vulnerability, and that vulnerability is the cost of meaning. Soft humor appears faintly, almost tenderly, in the observation that even the most disciplined minds cannot schedule grief, and that philosophy offers guidance, not anesthesia. The camera of attention drifts outward now, watching Seneca's words detach from his body and begin their long, independent journey, copied, quoted, misunderstood, rediscovered, because ideas outlive their authors in unpredictable ways. His fear of death, once private, now becomes part of his public legacy, debated, analyzed, and often simplified. Yet the nuance remains available to those who read him slowly. Historians still argue whether Seneca's life invalidates or enriches his philosophy, but enrichment seems unavoidable, because ideas tested by fear carry a weight untouched by certainty. His contradictions no longer appear as flaws, but as evidence of engagement, of a man attempting alignment rather than perfection. Seneca's acceptance of imperfection becomes one of his most enduring contributions, because it frees later readers from the burden of needing to feel fearless in order to act wisely. His calm did not come from absence of anxiety, but from relationship with it, and this relationship remains instructive precisely because it is unfinished. As the narrative continues forward, his presence lingers, not as authority, but as companion, offering reassurance that fear does not disqualify understanding, that trembling does not negate clarity. The night deepens further, and the listener feels the story settle into a quieter register, where urgency dissolves and reflection takes precedence. Seneca's death no longer feels like an event to judge, but like a passage within a larger rhythm, one moment in an ongoing human conversation about limits, meaning, and courage. In this quiet aftermath, fear loses its sharpness, softened by perspective, by continuity, by the recognition that endings do not erase effort. The darkness surrounding the listener feels less like absence and more like space, a place where thought can rest without needing to resolve everything, where Seneca's voice fades not into silence, but into background presence, steady and calm, allowing the mind to relax into the understanding that even imperfect wisdom can illuminate the way forward, gently, patiently, without demand. The story moves forward without any break, and Seneca's presence now exists almost entirely as resonance rather than voice, a tone absorbed into the long human habit of reflecting on fear, mortality, and meaning after the one who first shaped the words has gone. His life begins to be told by others, summarized, edited, judged, and simplified, because history prefers clarity even when truth is complex, and Seneca's complexity resists tidy conclusions. Historians still argue whether he should be remembered primarily as a compromised courtier or as a sincere philosopher. Yet this very debate mirrors the tension he lived with consciously, never denying the gap between ideal and circumstance, never pretending that wisdom abolishes difficulty. His writings circulate through generations that no longer recognize Nero's Rome, yet immediately recognize Seneca's inner landscape, because fear of death, fear of loss, and fear of wasted life do not belong to any single century. Readers encounter his calm not as command, but as invitation, a suggestion that fear can be examined rather than obeyed. And this suggestion feels quietly radical even now. Soft humor surfaces faintly in the realization that Seneca's struggle to reconcile wealth and attachment resembles modern attempts to reconcile ambition and peace, as if history keeps offering the same dilemma with new costumes. His legacy becomes less about stoicism as system and more about stoicism as posture, a way of standing inside uncertainty without collapse. And this posture feels usable precisely because it is imperfect. Seneca never offers guarantees. He offers orientation, a way to face fear without dramatizing it, to face death without mythologizing it. And this restraint gives his work endurance. The camera of attention drifts through centuries, where his words resurface during plagues, wars, personal losses, and quiet nights, moments when fear seeks language and finds his waiting. He writes that nothing dreadful is sudden, that the mind prepares itself in advance, whether consciously or not, and this insight gently reframes anxiety as rehearsal rather than prophecy. Historians still debate whether Seneca's own rehearsals succeeded fully, but full success was never his claim. Readiness, not perfection, was always the aim. His acceptance of human inconsistency becomes increasingly central here, because it removes the expectation that wisdom requires flawless execution. Instead, wisdom becomes something practiced, interrupted, resumed, and practiced again. Seneca's voice remains gentle, acknowledging that fear may return even after long periods of calm, and that its return does not erase progress, because progress in the inner life does not move in straight lines. Soft humor flickers again in his observation that humans expect finality from understanding while continuing to learn everything else gradually, a mismatch that reveals impatience more than failure. As the narrative continues, his influence shifts from explicit instruction to quiet permission, permission to be afraid without panic, to be thoughtful without certainty, to be finite without despair. He reframes mortality not as insult, but as condition, a boundary that makes choice meaningful rather than pointless. And this reframing softens fear by relocating it within structure rather than chaos. Seneca's own death, imperfect and prolonged, now feels less like contradiction and more like confirmation, illustrating that philosophy does not remove pain, but can preserve clarity within it. His life demonstrates that courage does not require dramatic resolution, only sustained attention, and that attention itself becomes a form of care. The night deepens further, and the listener feels the story slowing, the pace easing, as Seneca's presence becomes almost ambient, like a steady temperature, rather than a voice demanding focus. He no longer instructs, he accompanies, reminding without urgency that fear diminishes when allowed to exist without amplification. Historians still argue over details of his character, but the enduring effect of his work suggests that readers recognize sincerity when they encounter it, even across distance. Seneca's contradictions become part of his usefulness because they allow others to enter the conversation without pretending to be wiser than they are. As the story glides onward, fear loses some of its authority, no longer framed as enemy or failure, but as signal, a reminder of attachment, of care, of attention. In this reframing, fear becomes quieter, more manageable, less demanding of immediate resolution. The darkness surrounding the listener feels increasingly gentle, no longer a symbol of ending, but of rest. A space where questions do not require answers, where reflection can slow to stillness. Seneca remains here not as monument, but as presence, offering reassurance that wisdom does not arrive as final clarity, but as ongoing relationship with uncertainty. And that within this relationship, the mind can settle, the body can rest, and fear can soften into something almost companionable. No longer urgent, no longer sharp, simply part of the human rhythm continuing quietly through time. The narrative continues its unbroken drift, and Seneca's presence now feels almost weightless, like a thought that arises naturally when the mind grows quiet enough to notice its own edges. His reflections begin to blur into the wider human conversation about mortality, because what he articulated was never meant to belong to him alone, but to anyone willing to sit honestly with fear rather than flee from it. He writes that death is not a punishment, but a conclusion, and that conclusions do not erase what precedes them, they complete it. A distinction that softens the sharpness with which fear usually approaches the end. Historians still argue whether Seneca's framing of death was shaped more by Stoic doctrine or by repeated confrontation with his own fragility, yet fragility as a way of clarifying doctrine until it becomes personal. His words now feel less like philosophy and more like reassurance, passed quietly from one person to another across time. A reminder that fear does not signal failure, but attention, that caring deeply enough to fear loss is evidence of engagement with life rather than weakness. Soft humor appears gently when Seneca observes that people treat death as an interruption of plans rather than the one certainty those plans quietly depend upon. An irony that dissolves some of fear's seriousness without dismissing it. The camera of attention lingers on his insistence that what matters is not how long one lives, but how fully one inhabits the time given. A principle that reframes anxiety about endings into care for presence. Seneca does not deny that the mind resists this shift. He acknowledges how deeply humans prefer future guarantees to present awareness, and he treats this preference with patience rather than correction. Historians still debate whether Seneca personally achieved the serenity he described, but serenity, as he understood it, was never permanent possession, only a recurring alignment regained whenever attention returned to what could be met rather than imagined. His acceptance of death now reads as an acceptance of limit, and limit, paradoxically, becomes the condition that makes choice meaningful, because without an ending, urgency would dissolve into indifference. Seneca reframes mortality as the quiet structure that holds life together, like the frame of a house that allows movement inside, unseen but essential. Soft humor flickers again in his awareness that humans spend enormous effort denying this structure while relying on it for motivation, a contradiction he presents without mockery. As the narrative drifts onward, his presence becomes increasingly soothing, no longer guiding thought actively, but shaping its background, creating a mental climate where fear has less oxygen. He encourages the listener to notice how fear loses intensity when it is no longer argued with, when it is allowed to exist without interpretation. And this noticing alone begins to soften its grip. Seneca's voice remains calm, almost tender, acknowledging that fear may return, that understanding does not immunize, and that repetition is not failure but practice. He reminds that wisdom is not the elimination of vulnerability, but the ability to remain oriented within it, a skill refined gradually rather than achieved suddenly. Historians still argue about the details of his character, but the persistence of his influence suggests that readers recognize something honest in his tone, something unforced and human. As the darkness deepens, the listener feels the story slowing further, the cadence easing as Seneca's reflections settle into the mind like familiar furniture in a dim room, no longer startling, no longer demanding attention. Fear in this quiet feels less like threat and more like information, a signal of care that does not require immediate response. The narrative continues forward without urgency, and Seneca remains present, not as teacher or example, but as quiet companionship, offering reassurance that life need not be perfected to be complete, that endings do not erase meaning, and that, within the acceptance of limit, the mind can finally rest, unburdened by the need to outrun what has always been walking beside it, gently, patiently, and without malice. The story continues its quiet, unbroken glide, and Seneca's presence now feels almost indistinguishable from the calm it encourages, a background awareness that no longer instructs but steadies. His reflections have traveled so far from their origin that they seem to arise naturally whenever a mind pauses long enough to notice its own finitude. Fear of death, once sharp and insistent, now appears in his writing as something softer, more familiar, a companion whose voice can be recognized without being obeyed. Seneca writes that fear loses much of its force when it is no longer mistaken for prophecy, when it is seen simply as a reaction passing through awareness. And this perspective gently demystifies anxiety without dismissing it. Historians still argue whether Seneca's calm represents philosophical achievement or literary construction. But the distinction fades in practice, because what matters to readers is not whether he felt fearless, but whether his words help them feel steadier. And for many they do. His emphasis on attention as refuge becomes central here, suggesting that when the mind rests fully in the present, fear finds little space to elaborate itself. Soft humor surfaces quietly when he notes that people fear death most when they are least engaged with life, as if emptiness invites anxiety to fill it, a remark that feels observational rather than judgmental. Seneca reframes engagement not as constant activity, but as presence, the willingness to inhabit even small moments fully, because presence reduces the mind's tendency to wander toward imagined endings. The camera of attention lingers on this idea, noticing how fear often arises when awareness drifts too far ahead or too far behind, neglecting the only moment where experience actually unfolds. Seneca encourages readers to practice returning gently, again and again, without frustration, understanding that wandering is habit, not flaw. Historians still debate whether his philosophy belongs more to ethics or psychology, Yet such categories blur when insight proves useful, regardless of label. His acceptance of death now feels inseparable from acceptance of life as process rather than possession, something participated in rather than owned. And this shift reduces the urgency to defend against loss. Seneca does not deny attachment. He acknowledges it as natural, even necessary. But he invites examination of how attachment becomes fear when it insists on permanence. This examination is never harsh. It unfolds gradually, through reflection rather than confrontation. Soft humor flickers again when he observes that humans demand guarantees from a world that has never offered them. A quiet acknowledgement of our tendency to negotiate with uncertainty rather than coexist with it. As the narrative moves forward, his voice grows almost whisper-soft, suggesting that understanding arrives most readily when the mind is no longer straining for resolution. He emphasizes that fear often recedes when one stops asking it to leave, and instead allows it to be present without urgency. A paradox that feels counterintuitive yet calming. Seneca's life, viewed from this distance, now reads less like contradiction and more like demonstration, showing that wisdom does not require ideal conditions, only sustained attention. His proximity to power, illness, wealth, and danger becomes context rather than verdict, illustrating how philosophy functions not as shield, but as orientation. Historians still argue whether Seneca's compromises undermine his teaching, but his teaching itself anticipates compromise, acknowledging that clarity often exists alongside constraint rather than beyond it. He writes that the goal is not to be untroubled, but to be less troubled by the same things, a modest aim that feels attainable and therefore comforting. As night deepens further, the listener feels the story slowing toward rest, the cadence easing as Seneca's reflections merge with quiet. Fear, in this space, no longer demands action or explanation. It becomes a sensation noticed and released, like a sound fading once attention no longer feeds it. Seneca reassures that this release does not require force, only patience, and that patience itself is a form of trust. Trust in one's ability to meet whatever arises. His final gift is not certainty, but confidence in process, the sense that even without answers, one can remain oriented. The darkness surrounding the listener now feels expansive rather than enclosing, a wide field rather than a narrow end, and within it, Seneca's presence lingers gently, no longer guiding thought, but supporting rest. He does not insist that fear disappear. He allows it to quiet naturally, like a tired guest settling into silence once it realizes it is no longer the center of attention. The story continues its forward motion, almost imperceptibly now, carrying the listener towards stillness rather than conclusion, preparing for the final soft descent, not through instruction, but through atmosphere. Seneca remains here as a quiet assurance that life need not be resolved to be complete, that fear need not be conquered to be calmed, and that awareness, once established, holds gently even as everything else changes. In this awareness, the mind loosens its grip on urgency, the body settles, and the night becomes a place of rest rather than resistance, a shared darkness where nothing is demanded, nothing is threatened, and everything that needed to be understood has already been felt, leaving only the quiet, steady presence that carries the story toward its final, unhurried close. The story reaches its final movement without any break or jolt, and Seneca's presence now feels like a settled warmth rather than a voice, a steady equilibrium that remains once reflection has done its quiet work. What endures is not his biography, not even his philosophy as system, but the posture he offers toward fear, a way of standing inside uncertainty without tightening against it. Seneca's life, once full of contradictions, now reads as a single continuous effort to live honestly within limits, to think clearly while afraid, to act with intention while knowing outcomes cannot be guaranteed. Historians still argue whether his wealth compromised his teachings or whether his proximity to power dulled his moral clarity. Yet these debates lose urgency here, because his value was never in perfection, but in persistence. He did not claim mastery over fear. He modeled conversation with it, returning again and again to the same questions, not because answers failed, but because practice requires repetition. Soft humor lingers faintly in the realization that after 2,000 years, humanity still fears death in remarkably familiar ways, as if time changes costumes, but not anxieties. And Seneca's calm acknowledgement of this continuity feels strangely comforting. His acceptance of mortality no longer appears as intellectual conclusion, but as emotional orientation, a way of inhabiting life without demanding that it remain open-ended. He reframed death not as negation, but as boundary, and boundary, once accepted, became structure rather than threat. The camera of attention now pulls back gently, revealing Seneca as one figure in a long human line of those who try to look directly at fear without flinching, not to conquer it, but to understand its shape. His final lesson is quiet and unassertive, that fear diminishes when it is no longer treated as enemy or oracle, when it is allowed to exist without command over meaning. He showed that courage does not require serenity, only sincerity, and that wisdom does not require certainty, only sustained attention. As the narrative eases toward rest, Seneca's presence becomes almost indistinguishable from the calm it has cultivated, a background steadiness that remains when questions have softened. The listener feels no demand to resolve anything, no pressure to reach conclusions, because Seneca never offered closure as achievement. He offered orientation, a way to return to balance whenever fear pulls the mind forward into imagined endings. Now, as the story slows fully, the mind can release effort, because nothing more is required. The darkness surrounding the listener feels gentle and familiar, not a symbol of loss, but of quiet continuity. The same darkness that held Seneca and countless others before and after him, without judgment. Time no longer presses, fear no longer instructs, and awareness rests comfortably where it is. The final breath of the story does not announce itself. It simply settles, like a thought completed, like a day allowed to end without resistance. In this stillness, Seneca's gift becomes clear. Not a doctrine, not a solution, but reassurance that life does not need to be conquered to be lived well, that fear does not need to be eliminated to be calmed, and that endings do not erase meaning, they complete it. The mind loosens, the body rests, and the long conversation with fear grows quiet, not because it has been silenced, but because it has been understood. The night holds everything gently now, and nothing more needs to be done. As the story fades into its final hush, time feels spacious, the breath feels even, and the listener drifts naturally towards sleep, accompanied not by answers, but by acceptance, steady and kind. The narrative now softens further, letting language slow and thin, as if words themselves are growing sleepy, no longer reaching outward, but settling inward, inviting the mind to rest in the simple rhythm of breathing and presence. Nothing remains to be proven, nothing to be remembered precisely, because the feeling has already taken root, a sense that fear is manageable, that endings are natural, that rest is allowed. The centuries recede gently, the figures dissolve into quiet, and only calm remains, steady and untroubled, carrying the listener downward into sleep without effort or resistance, as if being held by the same patient darkness that has always been there, waiting. Sweet dreams.